Well, welcome everybody to another one of our Lunch in the Garden programs. My name is David Chinnery. I'm coming to you from Cornell Cooperative Extension here in Rensselaer County, New York. It's a beautiful, sort of blustery April day, and today we're celebrating Earth Day. So we have a very special program done by two of our master gardeners, Betsy Kauffman and Cathy Welling. They're going to be talking to us about the things that matter, the little things that matter in the world, the insect populations and what is going on with those. Cathy and Betsy are two of our outstanding Master Gardener volunteers. They've both been involved in native plants quite a bit, as well as many other projects that we do. This is a new program for them. So Betsy, Cathy, please take it away. And thank you.
Right, we will. And I'm Cathy Welling.
I'm Betsy Kauffman.
And Betsy's going to start us off, kind of giving us some good, solid background about what's going on. And then I'm going to take over and talk a little bit more about decline. So I'll let Betsy get started.
Thank you. So this picture on the screen right now is taken from a New York Times Magazine article entitled "The Insect Apocalypse is Here." And it's a catchy phrase, but my theme here is this quotation, "the little things that run the world," which is from the writings of E.O. Wilson, a scientist, and I'll tell you about him in just a minute. So actually our theme is there an insect apocalypse or isn't there, and how should we think about it? First of all, I want to introduce you, if you don't already know, about Doug Palamy. He's a scientist. He's a professor and head of the Department of Entomology in the University of Delaware. He's written 5 books and numerous scientific papers based on the research that he's done in the field. And he's sort of a charismatic symbol for native plants, especially here in the U.S., but I think his fame is spreading at least into Europe as well. His books are very popular, and we first started learning about him in 2018 and became very interested in native plants. And it doesn't seem like that long ago, but a lot has happened since then, and the interest in planting native plants and why you want to do it seems to be in the news all the time. And his writings and his presentations are very approachable. So he's been a wonderful guide to us. The second person I want to introduce to you is Edward Osborne Wilson, who lived from 1929 to 2021. He was an American biologist, a naturalist, and a writer. I would say primarily he was a scientist, and he was the world's expert on ants at one time. The study of ants is called myrmecology. He was sometimes called the new Darwin and the father of biodiversity. And he wrote lots and lots of papers. He wrote a huge encyclopedic book on ants, which won a Pulitzer Prize at the time. But why I was interested was because he wrote a monograph in 2018, and the title of it was "The Little Things That Run the World." And because it's such a catchy phrase, you see this quoted a lot in literature and popular press too. I'll get back to him shortly because I'm going to just introduce the background about the little things that run the world, and then we'll go forward. So starting off, these are quotes that have been found in the press, in scientific papers, as well as blogs, little short reports, newspaper articles that we're putting them in quotes because we consider this an exaggerated response to the decline of insects. But starting about in the 1980s, there were more and more reports because more people were getting involved in it. More people were aware of invertebrates, believe it or not. And these reports started coming out, and they were good, solid reports from experienced entomologists and reports that were more casually from citizen scientists and even anecdotal information about a decrease in insect population. The problem is that these experiments to determine how many insects there are in the world are pretty hard to do. But I'm putting these all in quotes and putting alarm bells here because we consider these exaggerated response when you say the insects are declining, but you call it an apocalypse or an Armageddon, which may be emphasizing things in the wrong direction. And the problems that we see, and you've seen that also in the press, is that it detracts denialists because, in fact, you can't have 78% reduction in insects. It just isn't true. So these exaggerations bring out the people who deny it. And so the response that we should have to this is to do more science, bring the facts out better, teach everybody about how science works and what these responses mean. So it's just something to keep in mind. Now, what are the facts? Well, I really don't know all the facts because it's kind of confusing. So insects, and I'm going to use the term insects and invertebrates simultaneously, but they are very different. The insects make up the biggest part of invertebrates, but they are a separate class of themselves. The insects that were surveyed the most, in the first half of this century and even before, were the ones that were most charismatic and the sexiest and the most numerous. And these include the butterflies, bees, wasps, beetles. Who are the rest? Well, there are certainly worms, mollusks, spiders, and crustaceans, but you don't hear as much about them. That's not that they aren't important, but the emphasis is on insects in most of these cases. How many insects are there in the world? Well, it's estimated that, has been estimated that there are 30 million insects in the world. Now, we know that we haven't identified 30 million. We really have only identified about 1 million. But the newest estimates that came out in 2018 by a man named Stork decided his estimate came, this is all done statistically, and I can't evaluate that because I'm not very good at that. But the newest estimate was 7 million, of which 5.5 million are insects. And within the insects, 1.5 billion are beetles. So 1 million insects have been discovered and named and studied to some extent. But within the 7 million, there are actually 80% that have yet to be discovered. So what we're doing when we do these surveillance to see how many insects there are, we're only really sampling a small portion of it. And it's just that the insects are too small, they're too numerous, they're variable, they require variable techniques. In some cases, you're going to capture insects. You might be putting down sticky traps or other types of traps, or you may be surveilling them in another way. So this is one of the problems to get hard facts or good numbers is the surveillance is not uniform. And it's not uniform because the insects are variable. They all are very different. They have diversity, let me say. Another problem is the nomenclature. Yes, the insects that have been studied have been named. They've given scientific names and even non-scientific names or common names. But sometimes they're so small, it's difficult to characterize them well. They're so small that sometimes they've been discovered twice and given different names, and they're really the same thing. So the scientists are trying to sort out this data that's coming in so that we cannot have redundancy. Another method that's being used more and more is DNA technology, because you can take a whole handful of biomass of insects and pop it into test tubes and look for specific DNA sequences, which would tell you something about their genetic structure. And this works to some extent, but it's a massive project and one that hasn't been used. Well, I'd say we're just on the first steps toward this. And the other biggest problem, really, one of the biggest is this sheer number of them. There's so many of them. They're so small, and they vary in abundance. They have fluctuations in outbreaks, and and die-offs too, but they come back. They're massively able to reproduce by a variety of different methods, which is great. But it makes it very difficult since you have this moving thing going on to actually quantify how many there are. So it's hard to quantify them if you don't have a starting point, and you can't do it at various intervals. But we try. It's been tried, and there's a lot of information out there. I have to bring up this ICUN red list. If you look into the right, the colored signs, you'll see that this red list is used to, at this point, the International Union for Conservation of Nature covers 172,000 species on a list where they evaluate their extinction risk based on the geographic range where they're found, their population size, their habitat and ecology, and they then put them in a category of extinction risk. And this is wonderful. They cover 172,000 species of a million. So you can see that they're missing a few. And they've gotten very good about, in years past, they didn't even cover the invertebrates. Now there are many, many more. This is a huge organization. There's a lot of people involved. There's actually various red lists. But one of the problems that has been spoken about is that they categorize and analyze these species in situ. In other words, they just look at one point, and they'll do some population studies, but they don't usually do a good, solid, progressive population trend. So you can see how many are here at one point and then another point, but you can't always tell how this is traveling. So things that are declining by scientific methods may actually be in the category that's called data deficient. But I wanted to mention this because as you see these colorful labels, you see these in the literature all the time, referring to something as extinct or critically endangered or near threatened. And there's actually a large group in data deficient, which makes it difficult. So this is what the red list is. And just so you're aware where these categories come from, because you'll see it often. Here's a little bit about the decline statistics. In 2017, Hallman et al. Published a huge study that took place in Germany protected areas. And their report came to the conclusion that there's a 76% decline in flying insect biomass in these areas. And the interesting thing and the valuable thing about this report was that it was long. They took the statistic, they did the statistics for 27 years. So this is indeed alarming. Another study by Lister and Garcia in 2018 studied climate-driven declines in arthropod abundance in a Puerto Rican rainforest. Again, this was more or less a protected environment, and they found biomass losses between 98% and 78% for ground and canopy dwelling arthropods. And again, this one was over a 36-year period. What was alarming about this study, not about the study, about the results, is that it represented annual losses of 2% for each group, approximately. If you look at it, if you think about it in the coming years, this is alarming if this continues this way. There was a study too by Wagner in 2020, and his study was sort of a compilation of the results and assessment of them. And two of the most frequently studied arthropods are butterflies and bees. And in looking at the many studies, Wagner came to the conclusion that the UK's lost 5 species of butterflies, and 70% of the remaining were declining both in occurrence and in abundance. And then lastly, in this page, the bees, which we know are important for the pollination services and certainly for food security and global economies, there was a decline both in managed bee colonies, that would be the beekeepers in agriculture and private agriculture, But there was also a decrease in the solitary native bees, which we know are just as capable as the imported European bees. Now, this last paper was actually a pretty enormous paper. It summarized 73 different scientific reports of insect decline. They put them all together and put them together. They put the signals on the map. You can see this map is actually a world map, and it shows you by the colorful bars where the studies were done that they put all together to statistically look at. Each one of the little blocks that are stacked onto another indicates an individual study. And the thing that strikes you the most, if you stand back and look at this, is that most of the studies were done in Europe. And the second most studies were done in the US, but there's an awful lot of blank area in the rest of the world. So this is wonderful. They were wonderful studies. They were very detailed. But they don't say that this is a worldwide view, and the conclusion that it is 40% extinction of all the world's insect species was going a little beyond the way it should have. But also, what isn't usually pointed out, but the study's cited quite often, and it was a very good study. It was just the conclusion wasn't terrific. But the study does also document that there are cases where species are increasing in number. So we can't forget that there are increases, and more often than you might think. So now that you see that there are indeed decreases in an insect population, it makes you think about what this is going to do for our environment. And I want to go on my favorite topic, which is what is an ecosystem, so that you can put this insect decline in place. So an ecosystem is really made up of living and dead things. Living things, the dead things are temperature, light, and climate, among other things, and we refer to those as abiotic. And the living things, of course, are the living, but there's also energy input from the sun and nutrients that cycle between the living and the non-living. Most importantly, you have to realize that an ecosystem is whatever you define it. Sometimes I like to call my backyard an ecosystem, and it is. And I can consider all the things in them and what they're contributing to the whole of my backyard. I could also call an ephemeral pond that exists in the hill beside me as a ecosystem too. In that case, it would be a pretty aquatic one, but not totally. So also an ecosystem could be a park. It could be a woods. It could be a county. So it's anything that you want. But what you have to understand is what is important when you're talking about an ecosystem, or important to me anyway, is the biodiversity that lives in it. And the biodiversity is simply variety of life on Earth and all its forms and the interactions of it. And it can be considered on three levels. You could call a whole ecosystem diversity. So you could say that we have diverse ecosystems. I've got a backyard with plants, and I've got a pond next to me, and these can be considered systems are diverse. But what's really important is species diversity. How many birds do I have in my backyard? How many invertebrates do I have in my backyard? How many species of birds do I have? How many species of trees do I have? The number of species of each thing is the diversity. And so if you have only one tree in your backyard, it's going to certainly perform some kind of ecosystem performance, but it isn't going to be as great and as productive as if you had more species. So species diversity means different species, but a lot of them. Abundance is what's important. But the most important level is the genetic diversity. The genetic diversity is right down to the chromosomes. And when we talk about diversity in genetics, we sometimes think about what we call monocultures, cultures that consist of plants which have all the same genes. They're vegetatively processed or regenerated from each other, and all of them is alike. But if some adverse event comes that you that you might, if you had a diverse population of trees, for instance, in the population, then if we had diverse genes, somewhere in there, there might be genes that enable them to survive. And so this is the importance of diverse genetics within a population. And when we talk about ecosystem diversity loss, or the insect biodiversity loss, and it's often hooked up with insect loss. They say, oh, we've got a loss of biodiversity. This is the loss of this genetic pool, which enables them to evolve and to resist invasion by non-native species or climate change, or resist pests, diseases, and pollution. So what makes our ecosystems run? I'll go through this very quickly because you all know that our ecosystems run on energy that we derive from the sun, and it moves from the sun to the plants becomes through chemical reactions, becomes a form of energy that powers all life on Earth. The transfer of energy to the plants then takes place from the food chain. Here quickly is a equation that describes photosynthesis in the simplest form, where it takes in a leaf or plant, takes in carbon dioxide and water. It absorbs photons of energy from the sun, and through actually a lot of complicated chemical reactions produces sugar, carbohydrates. They're all the same. They're carbon chains that are the building blocks of our bodies. And they also excrete oxygen. So now we've got energy in the plants. How does the energy transport through the whole environment? This is actually done by the food chain. Oh, here's a picture. The food chain, in this case, it's a linear food chain. We start off with the primary producers, which are the plants on the left. And once they have photosynthesized and they've got the sugar and the carbohydrates in their system, they are then eaten by small mammals and insects. The insects are important, and these are the primary consumers. People don't know how much the insects eat plants. You see it every day, though. I mean, you see it in your garden, you see it in your vegetable patch with all those holes in leaves. You see it in the shrubs and young trees where there's caterpillars eating the leaves. This is all part of the food chain, and it's necessary to get that energy throughout the system. I mean, it's incredible that it all works, because it looks kind of on paper in a diagram like this pretty simple. At the end of the food chain, the food chain actually doesn't revolve. It goes linear, and then it turns into debris or waste at the end. And then this is picked up by the decomposers in the soil. So all of this energy moving through the ecosystem and in material form eventually dies, and it must be recycled again. And that's what the decomposers do. This is just the waste products. And so these decomposers consist of the earthworms, the bacteria, and fungi, as well as a whole ton of invertebrates as well. So this is actually the true cycle. Sometimes the decomposers are called the brown chain. Now I'm getting back to E.O. Wilson and the quote from him that says, "The little things that run the world." He wrote a monograph in 2018 after he gave an address at the new invertebrate exhibit of the National Zoological Park. He talked about the outrageous number of invertebrates there are compared to vertebrates, and why their numbers are so diverse. And he thought maybe it was because their sizes were small, and they've lived on the Earth. They evolved on our Earth millions of years before the vertebrates came by. So they're so numerous, and they're small, so you can fit a lot into one area. I kind of like these facts that in a Brazilian rainforest, 1 hectare of land, and that would be about 2.5 acres, would really, you could imagine that they would only contain about 20 birds and mammals, but they would contain a billion or more than a billion invertebrates, just to show the difference between vertebrates and invertebrates. It's rather massive. But this is the statement that is very important. He said the truth is that we need invertebrates, but they don't need us. If humans were to disappear tomorrow, the world would go on with little change. But if invertebrates were to disappear, he doubts that the human species could last more than a few months. What would happen is that most of the fishes, amphibians, birds, and mammals would crash to extinction. The flowering plants would also crash. Along with them, the physical structure of the majority of forests and other terrestrial habitats, and the earth would rot. Next, dead vegetation would pile up and dry out and narrow the channels that nutrients flow through. And the remaining fungi, he says, that after enjoying a population explosion of stupendous proportions, would also perish. And he goes on and says, within a few decades, the world would return to the state of a billion years ago, composed primarily of bacteria, algae, and a few other very simple multicellular plants. The conclusion, he says, is that a new emphasis should be placed on the conservation of invertebrates. And their staggering abundance and diversity should not lead us to think that they're indestructible. They're just as subject to extinction due to human interference as they are those birds and mammals. Now, with this kind of glum picture, I'm going to pass this on to Cathy to pick it up again and say, what were the causes of this decline in insect populations and some suggestions on how we should approach this.
So Betsy's given us a really good foundation of kind of looking at the background and what the statistics are saying about decline. And what we want to do first is take a look, we go back to EO's quotes, how do these insects run the world? And what are the specific functions that they perform that make them so important? So we're going to take a look at a variety of these things. And this is just a visual that I had gotten from the World Wildlife Fund magazine from spring of 2023, which I thought was a really nice depiction of these insects. And we're going to go through these and look at what the various functions are. So I'm using some terminology that came from this World Wildlife Fund paper or magazine that I read, which I thought was just kind of a clever way to present this. So we can start off by looking at insects that act as water filters, and they use the example of this caddisfly. Most of the time we think of caddisflies as being food for trout, but they really perform a function in the aquatic system of actually they'll consume plant material, they'll consume living plants, they even will consume some other living and dead organisms. So they act like a little bit like cleaners to clean the water that's in the ponds and the aquatic systems. So that's one function that they perform. They give us fresh water. The next one, this was there's a little bit of controversy about this, about the function of insects as pollinators for our food crop. You often will hear the statistic of they pollinate 30 to 35% of our food crops. And according to some writing by in Doug Tallamy's book, the book is, which one is that? It's the How Can I Help? He cites an entomologist named May Barenbaum, who actually did kind of an analysis of the research that's out there about crop pollination, and she really didn't find any studies that supported this claim of 38, 35%. What she found in the research that she reviewed was that about 1/7 of our crops actually depend on pollination by animals. But if we look at a typical American diet, which is very heavily based on corn and wheat, neither of which are pollinated by animals, they're wind pollinated, really about 1/12 of our crops are actually dependent on pollinators. But if we have a tendency sometimes to kind of think about the value of insects to us as humans, which is very anthropocentric. And if we're thinking about pollinators, they really perform many other functions besides how they support us. So for instance, the insects pollinate 80% of all plants, 90% of all flowering plants. And as Betsy just talked about, those are the very plants that take that sun energy and convert it into food for all of us, for animals, for insects, etc. So they perform a greater function besides what they offer to us as humans. But of course, if we didn't have bees, we wouldn't have blueberries or tomatoes because they are important in the pollination. Although tomatoes are self-pollinated, those bees get in there and they shake the pollen around, they get it to move. Same thing with blueberries. So if we didn't have bees, we wouldn't have blueberries for our Wheaties or tomatoes for our salad for lunch. So they do perform important functions for us as well. Bird bites. We also know that birds are really reliant on the insect populations to feed their young. And these example of eastern phoebes they feed on yellow jacket wasps. And I think we've mentioned in other presentations that we've done, we've talked about Desiree Narango's research from 2016, where she was looking at Caroline chickadee populations. They have a brood usually of about 5 chicks. And according to her research, it takes between 6,000 and 9,000 caterpillars for that brood of 5 newborn hatchlings to reach fledge. And so that's a lot of caterpillars a day for almost 3 weeks. And so there's a lot of consumption. She's now actually Dr. Desiree Narango, and she is a conservation ecologist at the Vermont Center for Eco Studies. She studied under Doug Tallamy at University of Delaware. So there is one estimate that said that worldwide, birds are consuming up to 500 tons of insects every year. That's a lot of insects that they're eating. So it's really a valuable function that they provide for birds. So in terms of farmers' friends, a lot of times when we think about insects and we think about crops, we tend to think about insects as pest species. But there is some research that was cited by the World Wildlife Fund that said that of the 1 million known species, about less than 1% of those actually cause damage to crops. And we know that there are some predatory insects like ground beetles that are actually increasing crop yields because they're eating the weeds, they're eating the pest species, so they're kind of keeping those things in check, and they're actually a farmer's friend instead of thinking of them as the nemesis. And Betsy had mentioned in that hectare of land how many insects lived or alive in there. And there was an estimate that I read that at any given time on Earth, there are about 10 quintillion, or 10 to the 19th, individual insects alive. That's a lot of insects. I don't even know what a billion is, no less a quintillion. So they are performing some good tasks for the farmers. Digging in the dirt, we're going to talk a little bit about dung beetles because there is research that shows that these dung beetles can actually sequester methane emissions from dairy and beef farms in the ground. And what they do is, you can see there's a picture of a dung beetle on the left, and on the right, you can see this what the dung beetle is doing. They actually will form these little balls from the cow pats or the beef pats from the dung that they find, these almost spherical balls, and they actually form those by using their heads and their front appendages to kind of roll this ball up. And then what they'll do is they'll bury that in a hole in the ground, and the female dung beetle will lay 1 egg per dung ball, and that will support the larvae that are hatched, will provide food for the larvae, and the beetle will pupate inside the dung ball, and then it will tunnel its way out. But what it does is by burying that dung ball, it actually prevents some of the pathogens that might be present in the dung from escaping. The pathogens have trouble surviving in the soil, with you thinking about all of the soil microbial community that's going to break it down. So they're really kind of sequestering both the methane and possible pathogens. They help to aerate the soil by digging these holes for the dung ball, and they also are dispersing seeds because those seeds are in the dung. So they perform a pretty good function by digging in the dirt. Also, they are involved in what we call crowd control. And what we know is that insect predators also help to keep down populations of other insects as well as arthropods, so caterpillars, spiders, crickets. And they use the example of this tarantula hawk, which you can see a picture of down in on the side. Sometimes we just think about wasps as being, they're going to sting us and they're scary. But they do perform an important function in terms of keeping things in check. And there's some estimates, again, from some research that's cited down below, that this work of these insects actually provide an estimated 416 billions of pest control. They're saving that every year. So they perform an important function. We tend to, again, think of them as being problematic, and this kind of might give us an example of why we kind of fear them a little bit. That is a picture of the tarantula hawk. And they do have a very fierce sting. They primarily go after tarantulas, and we do find them in the southwestern United States. But they will sting humans. It's not a fatal sting, but it's a very severe, debilitating sting that can cause paralysis for like 5 minutes. It feels like you've been stung by like you've gotten an electric shock. And the experts who deal with this suggest that you just lie down and scream until it's over. So it's a little scary, but again, they perform an important function. Just stay away from them. And then also we can look at dragonflies. Dragonflies kind of have hold a special place in many people's hearts. They're very desirable insects that we see. And they've been around for a long time, long before the dinosaurs were here. And they use the example of the Halloween pennant, which is a predator of mosquitoes. All dragonflies are predators of mosquitoes. So that can be really helpful because, as we know, mosquitoes can be vectors for diseases like malaria, like dengue fever, like West Nile, yellow fever. So they're helping to, again, minimize the transmission of these diseases by eating the mosquitoes. And some estimates say that they consume hundreds of mosquitoes in a single day. So they're welcome. I think we welcome them in our yards to deal with that. And I thought, oh, a Halloween pennant. I've never heard of that particular dragonfly. What does it look like? So I went online to see if I could find a picture, and this is what came up. And I don't think that's the Halloween pennant we're talking about. We're actually talking about this little character. So much more interesting than the Halloween pennant that you can get for your party. And then lastly, and this really Betsy talked about it earlier about the importance of the brown food web, what's happening with the decomposition, and carrion feeding insects. And this is an example of an American burying beetle. They perform a really important role of cleaning up our environment. So their job is to decompose the animal flesh that's been, animals that have died, and they clean them up. They help the environment look a little bit better. And you can imagine if they weren't doing that, and there would be an accumulation of all that animal waste, what it would look like and also what it would smell like. It would not be a pleasant place. So they perform a really important function with that. So then if we take a look again back at this visual, we can see up in the right-hand corner, up in the northeast, we have the water filters, the caddisfly that's doing the filtering, and we look up in the Pacific Northwest, we have the bumblebee that's assisting with the pollination for the butterflies, or for the blueberries. And then we have in the center, we have the birds that are eating the insects and providing them for their young. And then we have the farmers' friends that are keeping pests and weeds in check for the farmers. And then digging in the dirt, we've got the dung beetles that are helping to sequester methane and helping to prevent the spread of pathogens. We have the crowd control. We have the predator insects over there. We have in the southwest, we have the tarantula hawk. And then we have the skeeter eaters down in the Alabama area, eating the mosquitoes and helping to prevent the spread of diseases. And then all throughout here, we have the undertakers, the ones who are breaking down, involved in the decomposition of animal products and other products as well. So they do perform really important functions all around. So Aldo Leopold, some of you may remember the Sand County Almanac. That was actually written originally in 1949. There have been a couple iterations since then. He's kind of considered to be the father of modern conservation, and he has a great quote attributed to him. He said, "The first rule of intelligent tinkering is to keep all the parts." And what we're seeing is that we're losing some of those parts. So our tinkering perhaps is not that intelligent. Um, for a lot of these insects, remember, we only know about 1 million species. We only have identified about 1 million species. We don't even know what all of that million species do. And for the rest of them, if we have another 6 million that we don't know anything about, we have no idea what their function is. So, and when we think about all the interactions between all of these organisms, insects as well as everything else, it's really difficult for us to tease out which of those insects are critical, which ones do we absolutely need, and which ones don't we need. We don't really know. And there were a couple researchers, Paul Ehrlich and Ann Ehrlich, they wrote a book back in the early 80s about extinction. And they used a great analogy for this. Um, they said that removing species from our ecosystems is a little bit like popping the rivets out of the wing of an airplane. You pop one rivet out, plane's still going to fly, no big deal. You pop another rivet, probably still going to be okay. We don't know, though, at what point, when we've lost enough of those rivets, are we going to suffer a catastrophic failure? And that's kind of what we're looking at with the insect decline, is we don't know where that catastrophic failure is going to occur. So we want to keep all the parts, or keep as many of the parts as we possibly can. So as Betsy said, we need the invertebrates, we need the insects. They don't necessarily need us, but we need to pay attention to those insects. So then what we really need to do is say, okay, we know we need them. We know what role they play. We know how important they are. So what's actually driving this decline? And this was this kind of visual and this concept of death by 1,000 cuts came from a paper for the proceedings of the National Academies of Science back in, I think it was 2021. And what they did was they looked at a number of different studies, and they sort of tried to come up with sort of what are the most prevalent causes of insect decline. And they sort of came up with this. And there's agreement in terms of all of these stressors, in terms of which is the most important, which is lesser importance. That's not really decided so much. There are some who would say it's climate change. Some say it's habitat loss. Some say it's the agribusiness. But what we do know is that it's really hard to isolate any one of these variables from another one and say it's specifically because of this. They work together. None of these work in isolation with one another. So we're going to take a look at several of these and kind of our big three that most researchers have decided make a difference. And then we're going to look at some additional ones as well. So again, remember that none of these is acting in isolation. They're all acting in concert with one another. So if we take a look, first of all, at climate change, what are some of the effects of climate change on our insect populations? First of all, we know that the ranges of insects are actually starting to shift. In particular, we look at European and North American bumblebees. They are losing their lower elevation range. Now we're starting to see them. They're tending to disappear from those lower ranges. They're moving higher up into more mountainous climates. So if there are plants in those lower ranges that are dependent upon the North American or European bees, they're not going to be pollinated. So that's going to result in some decline. We can look at phenological mismatch. That's a big word. Phenology, did I get that right? Phenology is the study of how insects respond to environmental cues such as temperature, light, things that are happening in the environment. So they respond to those in ways. And what we know about, in particular, there was some research on these montane plants. Those are things that grow at like 5,500 to 10,000 feet above sea level. things like Colorado blue spruce, aspens, lodgepole pines, but also herbaceous plants like columbines or sedges or geraniums. What they found is that for those particular plants, some of them are coming into flower before the pollinators that they depend on are coming out of hibernation. So they're losing the opportunity to be pollinated. There's a small window that they're going to be flowering, and their insects are not there to do the pollination. So we're seeing some decline in those plants as a result. Betsy already mentioned the Puerto Rican rainforest, the Lister and Garcia study that showed that what they did is they found there again, it's hard to tease out just one particular impact, but what they were looking at was the increase in temperature. They had a 2 degree Celsius increase over the 35 years that they studied this. And they tended to, there were obviously were other impacts that were happening in this community, but that was sort of the primary one that was happening was the temperature increase. And again, they found somewhere between 75 and 98% of the insects were declining, and that depended on the time of year that they were actually doing the research. So we can see that global warming is having an impact on the insect populations as well. And then we also know the unpredictable rainfall. Particularly, we're seeing droughts in places right now in Colorado. They did not have the snowpack that they normally have every year. So now we're looking at drought conditions, and we know what effect that those drought conditions can have on forest populations. And we know that also it can actually directly affect insects by causing desiccation, but it also is going to either weaken the host plants or it's going to deplete those nectar sources that they're relying on. The water tables are diminishing. The soil chemistry is actually being changed. So all of that is going to affect how the insects interact with the community and potentially result in this decline. So that's the first part. That's climate change. The second part, and some would argue that this is an even bigger issue than climate change, is the loss and the degradation of the habitat. We know that as the habitat is lost, what happens is we end up with fewer food sources. They don't have sites for breeding. They don't have areas for shelter. And we see this oftentimes in those production of monocultures. The agribusiness creates these large monocultures. We're going to talk about that in a moment. But we also see that in things like urbanization, that's mentioned down below, where there's the loss of habitat that's being paved over. Or maybe it's the building of industries, or it's the building of these giant warehouses. We're losing the natural wild systems that they would be there without that. So fragmentation and isolation, as the wild spaces are broken up, it's more difficult for the insects to find mates because now they're sort of limited to where they can move because there's no way for them to get to the next ecosystem. They're also losing food sources. So that leads to insect decline. And I mentioned urbanization. And then deforestation is another issue. We know that there's a link between deforestation and climate change. And we see that fire, erosion, floods, we see those fluctuations in our weather patterns that are a result of deforestation. I read a really interesting little article this morning in the New York Times. You might have seen this as well. It was an article that said that tropical forest ecosystems are actually appearing to recover more quickly than previously was believed. It used to be believed that it would take centuries for these deforested areas to recover, but now they're looking at perhaps decades, which is still not good, but it's better than centuries. So there's hope. There is some hope for this. And then, of course, all of this is going to result in the loss of biodiversity. And Betsy's already talked about the importance of biodiversity. We can take a look at agriculture. And again, we're talking about agribusiness, that we've lost our small family farms that are diverse, that are growing diverse populations of crops. Now we're looking at these larger fields. They're near perfect monocultures, whether it's corn or wheat or soybeans or something else along those lines. So we're eliminating the biodiversity as a result of that. And all of this obviously contributes to the destruction of the habitat. It creates additional isolation and fragmentation of habitats for the insects. When we look at pesticides and herbicide use, pesticides create like a direct toxicity to insects. Um, and then herbicides tend to be more of an indirect because they're altering the habitat. They're killing off the plants that are needed for either for food sources or for host plants for reproduction. And there's been research that shows that the pollen and the nectar stores of wild and domesticated bees that live kind of near these large agricultural environments or even suburban areas, that they're finding that they are contaminated with a very complex combination of chemicals that have come from these areas. So, they could be insecticides, herbicides, fungicides, neo, I call them neonics because it's hard to say neonicotinoids. Easier to say neonics. So we're seeing that is, they're being affected by these pesticides and herbicides. So if we talk a little bit about the neonics, these are considered kind of to be like the DDT of the 20th century. You might remember the DDT was, I think that was banned in like 1972. It was very heavily used from the 1940s to the 1970s. And we remember it was affecting the shells on birds, eggs, etc. And it was actually banned. But we're seeing the neonics, and what's happening. The neonics are used worldwide, and they are used on about 140 different crop species, and they tend to kill a variety of pests, which is why they're being used. They kill sapsuckers, they kill aphids, they kill grubs. So it's a very effective at doing that. But what the problem is, what's done is that the neonics are used to coat the seed coating of the crops. But the problem is that only 20% of those chemicals are taken up by the crop. The rest of it is accumulating in the water, it's accumulating in the soil, and it has a very long half-life. It takes a long time for those to break down in the soil. And there actually was some research done. It was a worldwide survey of neonics in honey, and this was from 2017. And in this research, they showed that the neonics were present in 75% of the honey samples that were taken from around the world. So we know that these chemicals are not only are they killing our insects outright, not only are they killing the habitats, the plants that are necessary for those insects, but they're also getting into the food products that the insects are responsible for. And then lastly, fertilizers and nitrification are adding those into the soil are actually changing the soil structure, changing the quality of the soil, and reducing that diversity of food source. So we can see agriculture plays a big role. And then a couple other ones, introduced species, sometimes we call them invasive species. When those species are introduced into communities, often they can outcompete the native species. And as a result, if they're outcompeting we use the example of the monarch butterfly and milkweed. If the introduced plant is outcompeting the milkweed, which the butterfly needs to lay its eggs on, we're going to lose the diversity there. We're going to lose the insects. So introduced species are affecting our populations because they're affecting the plants. And then also light pollution. We don't always think about this, but there is a term called ALAN, artificial light at night. And what we know about that, these light, whether we're talking about light from a porch light outside your house, or we're talking about sky glow from urban areas, it affects all the natural patterns of insects. It affects their ability to move. It affects their ability to forage for food. It can even affect their reproduction. There are some insects that rely on a certain period of darkness in order to reproduce. So if they're in an area where they don't have that darkness, that's going to reduce their ability to reproduce. It makes them more subject to predation, and it also affects development. So one estimate is that a third of the insects that are attracted to artificial light at night are actually dead by morning. And they're dying because they're exhausted from flying. They continue to fly and continue to fly all night. And they're also, as I said, subject to predation. So it's easier to find them and to actually pick them off. So those are some additional ones. Kind of depressing, isn't it? We look at all of these challenges that we're dealing with. And this was a paper that was written by Robert Cowie, Philippe Boucher, and Benoit Fontaine. And this was I think it was in 2020, if I'm not mistaken. Oh, 2022. I'm sorry. You can see it. I can't on the screen. And here's what they said. They said, denying the crisis, simply accepting it and doing nothing, or even embracing it for the ostensible benefit of humanity are not appropriate options and pave the way for the Earth to continue on its sad trajectory towards a sixth mass extinction. You should try to say that 3 times fast. Sixth mass extinction. It's tricky. Well, they say this, but at the same time, they also said that we can't just throw up our hands and accept this. We can't just embrace this extinction. We have to do something about it, and we can. So even though it seems really depressing and sort of like, how do we manage? How do we handle all of this? There are things that can be done, and we want to just kind of briefly touch on a few things that we've come across as possible interventions for dealing with this extinction. So what can we do? All right, let's start with science. We've mentioned a whole bunch of scientific studies that we found, and there's ongoing studies. But what we really want to make sure we're doing is we're having rigorous, well-planned, coordinated studies so that people are working in conjunction with one another rather than in isolation. And they can share their data, they can share their results, they can share their findings. We also want to rely on citizen scientists. Betsy mentioned earlier the Krefeld study that was done in Germany. And a lot of the information in that study actually came from citizen scientists. So we should encourage that. And we do have that. We have that happening. There's the Krefeld study we mentioned. There are bird counts. There is eBirds. The eBird, people are recording what they're seeing in eBird. So there is citizen science going on, and we want to encourage that. When we think about politics, well, we want to do whatever we can to lobby for policies that are going to support preserving biodiversity. And things have been done. For instance, in the European Union, there has been a ban on a number of the neonics. So it can be done, but we have to put pressure on people to get that done. In the current political environment, it's a challenge, but we can do things about it. So let's continue working on that. When we find places where things are working, where things are going well, we want to make sure we preserve those hot spots. We know that we have to accept that decline is happening. We have to document that decline is happening. We may even have to preserve the evidence of it. We go to the museum and we look at dinosaur bones. Well, maybe we have to do the same thing with some of these insect species that may be going extinct or maybe are endangered. We want to recognize that, but we want to also look at what's being done that is helpful. And so we want to pay attention to those things. And then as individuals and small communities, we can do things on our own. Doug Tallamy is a proponent of the homegrown national park concept, where we can plant native plants in our own yards. We can reduce the monoculture of lawn by planting more plants that are pollinator friendly. We can do that. There's the pollinator pathways. How do we diminish that fragmentation and isolation by creating pathways so that those insects can move more easily? They can find their mates. They can find food sources. And so we can do things on an individual or even on a small community level. Agriculture that's a huge challenge, because we have to try to balance our need to feed the world with policies that maybe minimize some of the damage that's being done. And as we saw in the European Union, they're able to do some of that work. So again, it goes back to our politics and working in conjunction with the science to help balance that out. Because we have to provide food. We can't, and there's more and more of us to provide food for. So we can't just ignore that. And then a really important part is the educational aspect. Betsy mentioned this already. We want to promote the facts. We want to get the message out about the importance of insects. We want to be sure we're educating the next generation and the next generation and the next generation after that. So we want to educate our young people about this. We want to emphasize facts over the hype and the exaggeration. Because those tend to attract deniers, and we want to minimize that voice because we do know that it is happening, but we also know that we can do things about it. So we want to end on a positive note that there is some movement. And again, we kind of go full circle back to Doug Tallamy. You can see we're definitely part of his fan club. And he writes about the things that we can do, and we can take his information and we can use that to make a difference. It's what if I can't do something small, I become paralyzed. So I think about my small circle of influence. What can I do in that? I do that, and that helps me feel like I'm contributing to minimizing the decline of insects.
Oh, yeah, this was a great thing to do on Earth Day, and I appreciate
Yes.
everybody that was here today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, and have a good Earth Day.